Hello everyone, welcome to PR2700 Project Management. This is Unit 10, Project Risk Management. I'm Paul Tilley, so come along and join me as we discuss this module. This module is found in Module 10 of the course, Project Risk Management, and you'll also find material in Chapter 11 of the textbook, Information Technology and Project Management. In this particular module, we'll be explaining the importance of risk management planning, risk response planning, and risk monitoring control, and we'll be identifying the likely source of risk in a project, and we'll perform a qualitative and quantitative risk analysis. As we've seen, project management has a bunch of key project knowledge areas. Time, cost, scope are the critical elements, and within each of those, risk plays an important role. With regards to risk, we're asking, what are the measures that we need to put in place to reduce project risk? From a scope perspective, we're saying, what is the product and project scope? What are the basic outcomes that we expect? From a cost perspective, what type and quantity of resources are we required to generate the estimates and allocate a budget for work packages for that? From a time perspective, what time and sequence of project work schedule do we need to put in place? So we got to really integrate all of those knowledge areas together in order to be able to complete the project. So time, cost, and scope all have an integrated concept with risk. First, we really need to define risk. Risk is the chance of something going wrong, and usually when things go wrong, it costs us money. We think about all the courses we've done in our program, we've always looked at risk to some degree or another. So the more activities that a business is involved in, the more projects it gets involved in, the higher the risk. It multiplies as we get more involved. And that means that it has greater consequences to the overall security organization and becomes increasingly important to manage. Basically, we have to ask these basic questions. What can possibly go wrong? And what possible events and factors can negatively affect the feasibility of a given project? So it's all about risk management. Risk management is really an art and a science. And what it does is identify, analyze, and responds to risk factors throughout the life of a project that's in the best interest of the organization and the best interest of the project objectives. Risk management has us predicting from the very beginning of the project what possible situations might happen and be able to plan for them and to plan around them. So there are events that could reduce or delay or even prevent the success of a project, and we need to think about those before the project ever starts. So what should we consider with regards to risk planning? We're going to ask some basic questions. What is likely to happen? What are the potential pitfalls that we can reach? What can be done to prevent or minimize this event? What are the signs something's wrong or if it's about to happen? And what are the outcomes if they do happen? Those are some basic things. So we really have to assess the level of risk and the probability of things happening as we move through this analysis. So, if we think about it, risk management process really begins by listing all these events that we've just done, estimating the chance that's actually going to happen, and calculating the consequences. And if we think about statistics, we think about project risk is really a function of the probability of the event happening times the consequences of event. So if something's highly probable but it has few consequences, it's not that important. But if it's not very probable but has huge consequences, it can get very important. So this magic combination of probability and consequences needs to be assessed for each risk item to determine where it should fit in terms of our collective consciousness with regards to planning for risk. So we can think of risk along a number of clusters. We'll call them risk clusters. Financial risk, anything involving money. Technology risk, anything involved in technology and what can change in technology. Commercial risk, competition, business environment, these things. Execution risk, which is doing it when we actually do it. And contract and legal risk. If we sign a contract with someone to pay them or sign a contract to do something for them, what are the risks involved there as we move through that? Some tangibles that flow out of those categories would be things like absenteeism, people not going to work, resignation, people leaving, staff pulled away, back to their departments, losing important key people, skills not available, don't have the right people with the right skills, incomplete specifications, time overruns, and working change orders is a big thing in a lot of projects where things get changed as we go along. This drives up the cost and extends the time. So the risk management process really flows through 4 basic stages. We're going to look at these in turn. We identify all the potential risks. That's the first task that we need to do. We need to analyze this probability and consequences that we just looked at. And we have to next look at risk mitigation. What do we need to put in place to prevent those things from happening to start with? And then if they do happen, the 4th stage is control and documentation. What do we do if something does happen? So the whole idea of risk identification, as I say, is sizing up the situation. What are the components of the situation? And let's evaluate each one of those components for potential risk factors. And as I said, these could be anything from financial to human resource to anything else, environmental, for example. How can we do this size up? Well, there's a number of factors that come into play and a number of choices and a number of sources. The first thing we talk about is something called a brainstorming meeting. A brainstorming meeting is really where people get together who are involved in the project and they just shoot the breeze, more or less, without any real analysis of each of the outcomes of what comes out of the brainstorming meeting. They shoot the breeze with regards to thinking, blue skying, whatever you want to call it, about what could potentially happen. What are the risks? So brainstorming, like the name suggests, really says, let's pull in as much, no matter how crazy it is, let's pull all those things in. We're going to have a giant list at the end of all the potential things. And that's really the point of brainstorming. Once we have that list, then when we move into stage 2, we'll do an assessment of each of those items. But brainstorming is not the only thing we can do. We can also ask experts. Now, this is a much more focused approach where we look to people who've done this before, who have some experience in the area, and we ask them what could potentially go wrong. Seeing they've been down the road and they have a good bit of insight into it, they should be able to give us an educated guess of what are some of the most likely problems that could crop up. So experts in the field could be people like engineers or people like other project planners or people who have been involved in other projects and have seen some of the challenges that they've posed. Tied with it is an assessment of past history. If we're an organization and we're about to embark on a project, let's look back at our previous projects and ask ourselves, what happened there? What was our experience with that? What were some of the challenges we faced? What was some of the things we did in order to address some of the problems in the past? Looking at past history, we can use it in order to learn from our mistakes and make sure we don't repeat them again. Normally, there's no such thing as using one of these. We use a combination of these, and this is this final multiple or team-based assessment. The multiple assessment draws in from many people, many experiences, many techniques in order to be able to define and evaluate risk. So ultimately, the first 3 get built into the 4th one, which is a combination of all things in order to get a good list of potential risks. Because remember, the goal is identify potential risks. Moving along in the process, now that we've identified the potential risks, we have a long list of risks. Now we're going to take each individual one and we're going to look at it and say, what are the chances of this happening? How likely is this particular risk that we've identified going to be? It will range from very likely to not very likely at all. So we really need to weigh down or to be able to prioritize what are the things that are most likely, put those first, what are the things that are least likely, and put those last. We also need to evaluate each one of the suggested problems that could come up, some of the potential risks, and evaluate or weight their potential consequence on the success of the project. Meaning that if, for example, there were a fire that would destroy everything, the consequences of a fire could be devastating. So very high consequences to a fire. A ladder falling down or a ladder breaking, it could have consequences if it fell on someone, but in terms of the overall success of the project, probably very low. So once we evaluate what is the likelihood and what is the consequence, then we can put them on this kind of what we call a matrix here. And what we're looking for to spend our time on is high consequence, high likelihood issues, the light blue box. Those are the ones that we need to focus on because those are the most likely things to happen, and those couple with likelihood to be the highest consequences. We have to address those. As we look at the next stage where we say, okay, well, what are ones that are high likelihood but less consequences? Well, we'll look at those too. And we know that, yeah, they're probably going to happen, but less consequences. We could probably plan around those very easily. On the opposite extreme, we have low likelihood and low consequences. Those are ones that we really don't have to spend a lot of time worrying about because if they do happen, they're not going to have great consequences. Again, we need to focus on high likelihood, high consequence issues and make sure we make a good plan to deal with those. So dealing with those and dealing with all of the risks require different approaches. And if we look at different approaches, we're really talking about risk mitigation strategies, stage 3. There we need to ask ourselves, okay, what are the things we need to do for each of those identified risks, okay? And really, there are 5 basic approaches. We can assume and accept the risk. That's what we do a lot of. I mean, there is a certain degree of risk in doing something, and we certainly have to assume a certain degree of risk whenever we do anything, walking across the road, for example. Now, if the risk is so great and the consequences are so great, that's going to be a high-level risk, a high-level concern. That's something that we spend a lot of time at. So, we could say, okay, let's assume the risk, but we need to put strategies in place to deal with that assumption. The others look at what do we do if we are going to assume the risk, but we need to manage it. The second one, for example, avoid risk. Well, what we do is we just do whatever we can to make that risk not happen. So, for example, if we found that an event was really high consequences and really high risk, we might just say, let's not do that. Let's simply avoid the risk. If for example, we thought that building a new building could bankrupt us and that the chances of where we plan to build a building, the chances of it being successful is very low, we're probably going to say to ourselves, let's not do that. Let's not build that building, So we're not willing to assume that risk. If it was just too high, we'd just simply avoid it. Most likely, if we're going to go ahead with a project, we need to control the risk, which is really the third one. And what we mean by controlling is putting strategies in place that take the risk into account, but again, we do everything possible to reduce or eliminate the impacts of these risks. People working at heights, for example, if you got a very tall building, you want to, the consequences of someone falling from a height is dire. Anything over 10 feet high is probably not going to be good for someone. So what do we do when we think about controlling risks? We do things like ensure that there's safety harnesses or ensure that the scaffolding is arranged so that people can't fall off. These sorts of things are what we talk about as controlling risk. We can also, the fourth one looks at transferring the risk. Now, transferring the risk really says we're not reducing it, we're just putting it on someone else. So when we buy insurance, for example, insurance is an example of transferring the risk. There is a risk that as we take a car out and drive it down the road that we're going to have an accident. The thing is, when we buy insurance, if we do have an accident, that company that we purchased the insurance from assumes a risk for us. That's what's known as transferring the risk. Again, transferring risk can be expensive. Insurance gets expensive, for example, so we need to work with it in terms of this issue of transferring. We need to work to ensure that all of the other things are in place too, such as controlling risk or potentially avoiding risk. The fifth one looks at a general strategy that we really need to do all the time with any project is watch and monitor risk. And that is constant evaluation for risk issues. What is it that we can manage or stop as we're going along? So if you see a problem, what can we do to manage risk on it? So proper scheduling, proper training, proper equipment, all of those things are an example of watching and monitoring risk. We kind of know that there's risk there. We do everything we can in order to minimize it. Fourth and important is the issue of controlling and documentation. We need to be able to do everything we can to minimize risk. And one of the things we can do in terms of controlling it is to monitor it completely, totally, as we move along. We see here, for example, that one of the big issues with regard to risk management is controlling and documentation. Planners need to develop and report, and that needs to be documented in a system for future reference. If an accident happens, why did it happen? What are some of the issues? Like airplanes, for example, there's a great deal of documentation on maintenance of an airplane, because if there was never an accident, you could go refer to what were some of the maintenance issues. Did something fall down? So documentation helps post-analysis, and it helps in the prevention. So the basic documentation needs to answer the 5 W's, who, what, where, when, and how. So this whole process is embodied in something called Project Risk Analysis and Management, or PRAM by any other name. So what PRAM does is it really looks at the processes, techniques, and methods that enable analysis and management of risk associated with a given project, what we've been talking about. So the key features of it looks at project management over the life cycle of a project, looks at risk management strategy and how it changes over the project life cycle. And what it does then is, considering those two, it synthesizes or brings forth a coherent approach to risk management. So when we think about this, it really does an analysis based on 9 distinct phases. The first phase is defining the issue, as we've seen. What are some of the issues related to the project potential risk? It then forces us to focus on specific issues and identify what it is that can go wrong. We then can create a structure that can help support or minimize risk. Then we state who owns that risk, who's responsible for mitigating it, who's responsible for managing it. So for example, if we have a building and we are putting up brick, and the brick could theoretically fall over or fall down, the people who are installing the brick are the ones that are responsible for ensuring that that doesn't happen, that procedures are in place to ensure that the brick is stable. As we've talked about too, we need to estimate and evaluate 6 and 7. We need to estimate what are the chances of something happening and evaluate the probability of it happening. From there, we plan to mitigate the risk. We plan not only at the beginning of the project, but throughout the project. And then the rest of the effort is spent on managing that risk. And that loops back around constantly to the define stage, because as we move along, new risks might be identified. So this 9-stage process really encompasses all we've talked about in this unit. What's the big advantages or the benefits of PRAM? Well, an organization and senior management are certainly the ones that are going to benefit most from this. If they have an understanding of the risks attached with a given project, that way they can consider those risks before they sign off and say, let's go ahead with this. So it's going to cost a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of effort. Let's minimize the risk so we can get the most out of it. The organization's clients also benefit. If a project is being built for someone, those clients want that project to be successful. And our job, if we're constructing it, is to ensure that that is done. So we want to give them, the receiver of the project, a good quality project at the end. They want to be happy. So certainly having a plan in place to minimize risk will certainly contribute towards that. The organization's project manager will also be the one that will benefit from this? Who looks good if the project goes through and risk is minimized, problems are minimized, and even if something does happen, if there's a plan in place to deal with it? I want to thank you for taking the opportunity to listen to these videos over the course of the course. This is the last unit. I appreciate you taking the time. If you have any questions, please let me know. All my contact information is right here. Good luck in your careers and enjoy a future in project management. I'm Paul Tilley. See you next time.